Great when I'm logged out of Zoom. And we're live. Welcome everyone to another NPM Open RFC meeting. Today's date is Wednesday, September the 16th. We'll be following along in the agenda issue that was number 231 in the NPM RFC's repo. And I'll copy and paste just for everybody's sake, as I usually do, spam the link to the meeting notes. Feel free to add yourself as an attendee. And we'll be following along the agenda there. Just a quick heads up and notice these calls and all communication on the RFC's repo and most of the NPM repos is covered by a code of conduct. The gist here is that we just ask you to be respectful of each other and each other's time and to please raise your hand if folks are speaking, you'd like to add comment. The desired outcomes of these calls are to give another channel and another means of communicating with the community and hopefully pushing forward initiatives and features in the projects and sourcing feedback as well. A couple quick announcements. Roy, I think you have one, something you did this morning.
Yeah, and a new pre-release is out for the beta of NPM 7. So make sure to go check it out.
And I think we'll have a blog post in a little bit here on that as well. And I wanted to give the floor to anybody else if they had any other announcements. If not, I'd love to do a couple quick introductions or essentially allow some folks to introduce themselves who haven't been on the call or in a while or before. Maybe Nathan, we can start with you. You can say hi, what you're up to, and what you've been doing at NPM, and what you're going to be doing in the future.
Sure. Hi, I am Nathan Lafreniere, and Nelf, as I'm widely known on the internet for the most part. I was the chief architect for the registry for quite a while, and spent most of my time working there and am now transitioning to the CLI side of things. Just started this week, so don't really have a firm grasp on what I'm doing quite yet, but I'm looking forward to working with everybody.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome to have you on board and focused on this side of the side of the equation. You've been doing a lot of the hard work behind the scenes, so it's great to have you working with us, and so you should be seeing a lot more of Nathan in these calls. Nick, I don't think we've seen you in a while. Like, did you want to quickly say hi, introduce yourself, what you're up to? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nick. I just fell down a Twitter rabbit hole. Darcy, I think you posted something about 20 minutes ago about a meeting starting live, and I got sick of listening to my Spotify playlist, and so I've replaced that chatter with yours. So thanks for including me as a part of your community. Rock on, everybody.
100%. That's what the call's about, and we appreciate folks jumping on. Brian, did you want to quickly maybe say hi, what you've been up to at NPM, and what you're going to be doing in the future here?
Yeah, hi. I'm Brian Jenkins. I've been at NPM for just over 2 years. I managed the backend team for most of that. Now I am coming back to engineering, and I'm just joined the CLI team a couple days ago, so I'm excited to be on this part of the project.
Yeah, so Nathan and Brian will be helping us out for folks that have been on the call or on these calls for a while now. It's great to have some more people to support, the work we've got in progress. So I think Mark, also, like, you joined last week. We've been following along for a while. We finally got your issue on the agenda for today that you've been poking us about. Did you want to just say hi and what you're up to?
Sure, yeah. I'm Mark. I'm a software developer over at the Sonatype. For those who don't know, Sonatype are responsible for the Nexus Repository Manager, Nexus IQ, and the likes. So yeah, that's about it.
Yeah. So we'll finally circle back on an old RFC that I know that you've been watching. So I think Christian, Roy, myself, Isaac, Wes, Jordan are we've been here for a while, so I'm not sure if we have to do intros, but yeah, it'd be great if we can dig in here. If you haven't already, Brian, for yourself, you can add yourself to the list of attendees in this HackMD doc. So it's a shared doc that we keep notes in. And we'll be following along with the items that essentially were chosen for this agenda. So the first of which is, I want to at least shine some light and talk a bit about RC 224. So no auto install for PeerDeps that are marked as optional. Essentially, I don't think there was any, and I can copy and paste the Christian, do you want to say hi, Christian? You want to do an intro? You can if you want.
No. I was just honored that you said that I'm a regular. So
oh, well,
that's about it.
That's great. So I copy and pasted the PR here. This is something that we've identified as requiring to land before we essentially ship a GA of NPM 7. And I think this is something that we're queuing up for, sort of the next task to take on. Isaac, I'm not sure if you had anything else you wanted to add there beyond that.
No, I think it's relatively reasonable. There's a little bit of subtlety in the fact that if a PeerDep will cause, if not installing it will cause an incorrect one to be resolved, then we do need to try to install it, or else we'll end up with an incorrect tree in some cases. So optional is basically either it has to be within this range or it has to be missing. If we want to say that peer optional is we're just not going to install it, we're going to accept whatever, then that's somewhat of a divergence from sort of optional semantics, which is a lot easier to do, but at that point it's just sort of a little bit more risky to go forward with.
Yep. I'm not sure if anybody had any other feedback. There hasn't been any pushback on supporting this. So in the calls that we've had and also the RC that Jeremy's put together. So yeah, it looks like it should be something that we can ratify potentially then. As it's written now, like, is there any qualms with us queuing?
No, we can mark it, move it to accept it, it's fine.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I think we just kept it open for the extra week in case, since it was issued and turned into a PR.
I noticed that in the RFC itself, as it's open now, the PR, there is still a couple of unresolved questions there. At least maybe like if they're all resolved, we should get rid of them before merging.
I think like the second, if anybody's looking at exactly what those unresolved questions are, they're towards the bottom here. I'll look for folks, just so you don't have to go looking. It's a good thing to note, Roy, for sure. Like, is the best option, should auto install false be implemented instead? I don't think that's necessary. I feel like that's like also like, what is that, like a double negative? Like it doesn't feel good to write as an API. It doesn't feel good to set as a config. So I think that, optional true, like if we respect that, that makes a lot of sense to me. So that question, personally, like that question, I think is resolved just by, supporting optional true. The second of which we can definitely poke other folks, and definitely Jeremy's done that by CCing Mael and I think
Zoltan?
Zoltan, yeah. I always forget exactly how to say his name. Yeah, this is, there's an opportunity here to have them also support this. So, but I don't think it should be a blocker for us to accept and then move forward. The last of which, can a solution be implemented before V7 is final? That should be the case. So we should have this out in a beta and/or release candidate before it's essentially GA. So that's something that also we can speak to.
So to that second to last point, I don't think it's going to be a challenge for PNPM and Yarn to implement not installing optional peer deps, since they don't install peer deps at all, right? It's
The other
they've already implemented it.
So I guess I inferred that they would be following suit in the future potentially with peer deps. Yeah. So. But yeah, that's a good thing to point out. They already support it, so it's great. It's a feature. Cool. So I think that essentially resolves that. What would be good is essentially to comment back, and I can take the action unless somebody else wants to, from just essentially referencing the meeting notes and the comments made here. I'm not sure if you can add that to the notes, Roy, that I'll follow up. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Cool. If there's nothing else on that item, then we can move on to the RFC 217. So adding the registry per package per organization support. There has not been any discussion on this since it was opened a couple weeks back. I don't think, again, it's not that controversial. This was an issue that was opened up, I think, to essentially, to summarize this, is to have per package scoped registry configuration capabilities. And I think this was something that we thought was, something acceptable. What might be good to discuss is whether or not we actually think this is a breaking change. I know offline, I've talked, I think, with Isaac about this and some other folks that I don't necessarily think it's a breaking change, but we can potentially talk about that, or if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, you actually convinced me in that last conversation. I walked back from that position. I don't think it is a breaking change. We can get it in a minor just fine. If it was, because it's limited to the configs in a given project, like there's no chance that it's going to get out in the wild and something's not going to install unless you have it or whatever. It's sort of scoped to the project and it's just adding a feature.
Is this another one that it's been open for a couple of weeks and there was an corresponding issue open before that? Is this something we want to ratify after this call?
Yeah, fine by me. I think I posted a link in there to where in the code the change would be made, and it's pretty straightforward.
Can I ask a question on this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is this part of the configuration, or is this going to be somehow in the your package.json file?
It'll be in the configuration. So
okay.
in the same way that you can do @scopes : registry equals my private registry, you'll be able to do @scope / package name : registry in your config.
Right. Understood. Okay, thank you.
So that's what makes it a non-breaking change, because it's not a change to package JSON or something else that's not going to be installable with V6.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have any other questions? No? Awesome. So those are the two sort of easy RCs. I thought that obviously we could get a bit of consensus around moving forward with. The next would be 195. So the RFC around for checking engine requirements on every install. And I'll link that here for folks. And the last person to actually, I think, comment on this was Jordan. So I know Jordan's in and out today.
I'm here.
Yeah, did you want to maybe comment on this? Or give like a brief summary on state of this?
Yeah.
I think the last time we talked about it, we kind of, I forget where we landed actually.
Yeah, I mean, I can give the same summary I gave last time, which is basically that, and I think it's roughly where we agreed on, which is that hopefully by default, engines are a warning. Like engine mismatches are a warning, not a failure. And engine strict turns it into a failure. In either case, there should be appropriate warning output that tells you that there's an engine mismatch. And that if there is a way, even if it's an imperfect or imprecise way, to store information in the lock file so that installs that don't change the lock file or that, or they don't change node modules or whatever can recheck those things, then that would be really helpful. So that if I make a project on like node 12 and switch to node 14 or something and that doesn't work, that I shouldn't have to like rimwrap node modules or regenerate my lock file or whatever in order to determine that. I should just type npm install like I would always do and get some sort of message that tells me this actually was meant to work on node 12. It's node 14. Right.
Yeah, whether we store that in the lock file or not is kind of comes down to sort of an implementation detail.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, it's essentially just sort of shuffling around some code that exists now, where we currently only check engines that are for packages that are being installed, and this would be go ahead and check all the engines for all the packages in the tree. We build that tree anyway, so we're already kind of walking over them. It's just a matter of kind of moving where that check is being done.
So are we okay with the way this is written then right now?
Yeah, there's nothing in the proposal that's changing what the default behavior is in terms of, making it strict by default or whatever. There was some back and forth on that in the discussion, but where we landed was we're still going to have it be a warning by default. It's just, do we warn on the whole tree or only the things we're actively installing? And this seems reasonable. We can accept this. Okay. Also, I don't know. I mean, this is sort of a breaking-ish change, but it feels pretty low risk. We probably ought to get it in prior to 7.0.0 GA because it will change the error and warning output.
That's good to note. Okay. So I'm just adding a label here for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But other than that, we think that's good enough and we can accept it then and move on. Moving on then to PR number 138, the RFC add npm app ID to the HTTP header. And Mark, I apologize that we did get this on for the last little while, or circle back to this. Would you like to maybe summarize the RFC itself and then sort of what updates you'd like to give or sort of what the next steps would look like?
Yeah, sure. So when this was initially proposed, actually by a colleague of mine, we were focusing, it wasn't very generic. So we were focusing on, we need an application ID to help us do audits that are particular to different policies that have been defined in our third-party scanner. Last time it was raised, it was felt that this could be a little bit more generic rather than being focused on app ID. So although the title is app ID, last we spoke, it was wanting to be generalized. So the proposal that was offered was to essentially have like a metadata object within the package.json file. And then that metadata content would be sent over as part of the HTTP header. So it essentially allows anybody to make use of that metadata object as they please, basically.
And was there ever any pushback on sort of that idea of it's just that we haven't implemented?
Sorry, go on, carry on.
So I think, I mean, if we have adding a new field to package JSON called metadata, that's definitely going to require. Sorry, I didn't catch that this change had been made in the proposal. That is going to require that we check to make sure that nobody's currently using the field metadata, and it's a little bit more, a little bit higher bar as far as where we usually land for adding changes to things. But and also if Yarn or PNPM are using the metadata field for something, we got to make sure we're not kind of causing confusion there. I'm wondering what use cases specifically we want to use metadata for, and if everything in metadata is going to be sent as kind of headers to the registry, then there might be kind of we could probably bike shed a little bit on just the spelling of it, if it's if it should instead be called like headers or something.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, at the moment, I know this is on the RFC, but I did actually raise a PR against this, which is for our use case, it was focusing on the NPM audit side of things only. I think there was talk about making this generic for every header. But yeah, we could certainly maybe change that metadata to be something a bit more specific to the header information itself.
Right. Or I would also just be fine with keeping it as app ID in package JSON, and then we send an NPM app ID header to the registry.
I think that was what the original proposal
was. The original one, yeah.
There was pushback against that because it was too specific, is what came back from the original proposal.
Wes, I think if I remember the conversation, Wes was the one who was like, we should broaden it a bit. I could be wrong if it was you.
No, I think it was me, because I was actually, one of the things we talked about the last time this was on the agenda was possibly trying to figure out a way to send the entire package JSON, but I understand why that's probably not a good idea. The generic stuff is really just because I think there is more value in keeping it open for a bunch of use cases out of this like lower level feature, right? So is that gonna get, sorry, I was also distracted there a second ago. So I think I must miss maybe the middle part of what you were saying. What was the concern about making it more generic?
Well, so the main thing is if we're adding a header called app, or a top level package JSON field called app ID, that we're pretty sure is not being used in the registry. We could kind of already done a scan for that and had some discussion and analysis around it. That just hasn't been done for the field named metadata. We could do it and figure that out. It's not particularly hard. It's just a task that has to be done before we can kind of ratify this. The other thing is, if my other pushback to calling it metadata is just if the use case is, this is a collection of key value pairs that are going to be added to HTTP headers to the NPM registry, right? Like that's kind of what this semantically is used for. Then there may be, maybe we should call it headers rather than metadata, just to kind of call out exactly what it is and make it more clear. Because in a sense, it's like metadata doesn't actually tell you much about what it's being used for. Like everything in package JSON is metadata, right?
Yeah, I think it would make sense to rename it headers, but then we'll probably have to do the same what you're talking about in terms of making sure we're not colliding.
I just wasn't sure whether this would be potentially used for other things. If someone's just parsing the package JSON file and they find the metadata useful, they may use it for other things other than what's sent over as a header. So naming it header might be actually limiting it potentially. That was why I tried to generify it slightly.
Right. I mean, if we're going to call something metadata, and there's going to be kind of blessed fields in there, then some of them are used for some things and others for other things. I would say just make them all top level fields, right? Like let's just add an app, like that gets us back to just add an app ID. And if you want to know the app ID for any reason, you look at package.json.appid.
So you can also make the argument that name is just already that and probably should be that for most use cases. The reason I think I like the headers idea, I would maybe think like registry headers or something, because also headers is fairly generic, because the point here is these are only in use when you're talking to the registry. But anyway, that's total bike shedding. Yeah.
Christian, did you have a comment you want to?
Yeah, I'm actually kind of thinking about if that might be helpful with something that we are doing, which is we're kind of trying to emulate at work the idea of Maven snapshots, which is basically like whenever we have a CI build, we have something that's falling out of the CI build, and we want to be able to get rid of those snapshots. And I could think that like if you had like something like a Nexus repository or something that would not be like the NPM registry, you would be able to say, if it has that metadata, put it in that folder and just like remove that folder like every other week or something, to, I don't know, in a way tag the things that you're pushing to the registry. That's just a use case I could think of.
Yeah, the generic use case of passing things to like a third-party registry, like I think that's exactly what this is meant for, right? And I think the like app ID, it doesn't map one-to-one to like the package name. So I think that's also why like Mark and their team were pushing for this. I see where there's benefits in de-scoping this back down to just like top level field, like just app ID if that's what you need, versus creating like a less larger object like that we're going to pass through each time. But
right. So I mean, the question is like, are the semantics around app ID going to be applied to everything else in this headers or metadata object? In other words, are we going to kind of send everything in that object as headers to the NPM registry? And if so, I mean, also like what happens if somebody puts like cookie or, authorization in there or something? Like, is that gonna mess stuff up?
But that actually might be, that's a feature we probably want. That's actually one of the things I was thinking of, right? Is if you have your own authentication proxy in the middle, right? That's actually a feature, not a bug or not an unintended side effect. Like that's, I think, valuable.
Right. And if that's the case, then we probably want to call it headers, and we probably want to be, very explicit about like, this is going to send additional headers to the NPM registry. And so you can put in there NPM -app -ID, or you can put in there, authorization or anything else that you want, and just every request to the registry in this project is going to get these headers attached to it. That's very simple to implement, and I think incredibly powerful for this use case as well as other generic ones. What I'm trying to avoid is a situation where we have a metadata field, and we have an app ID. If it sees metadata.appid, it does one thing. If it sees metadata.auth proxy, it does a different thing, and so on and so forth. And then it kind of becomes like yet another config level. You know what I mean? In a kind of weird orthogonal way. If we're only going to attach these semantics to the field, the app ID field, then that should be the top level thing. If we're going to attach the same semantics to everything in this collection, then the collection should be the top level thing. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I think so.
Okay.
I was wondering if this should be a config thing that's supported, like an npm RC specific, and not live in the package JSON. That's kind of where my head was going. And I was trying to see, Mark, if there was any previous discussion as to why that might not be like what you want, or you want to distribute this config in the package JSON.
One other thing that may be worth considering here is that we in prior discussions, we had talked about app ID specifically being something that the server can set. So for example, the first time it sees an audit, it could mint a token and give you that and say, okay, this is your app ID. Hold on to it and give it back to me later. And if that's the case, then that is additional different semantics than just send, manually type this in and then send those headers.
Yeah, I do think if I remember that conversation, it was that you can pass this through and then this would be information that could then be given back to anybody that's installing the package, right? So this would be stored in like the package somehow.
So you're suggesting we should like descope, like take a step back and maybe just focus on that behavior of attaching the header for the sake of auditing only?
I'm interested in what we can do like in the near, yeah, descoping and thinking about the first step of this, which is what's the client, like what can the CLI support and what's makes sense for it to support right away. And like, this seems like it would almost be like a config level, like an npm-rc value, right? Like headers or something we could put in there. And that would actually be a bit safer than having to bless like a new key in package JSON.
The reason for it wouldn't work in our case as for a config is that each application will have a different application ID because...
Yeah, you can put a .npm-rc file in each project.
So you're suggesting that would need to be committed per project instead. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So the only conflict there would be if people are using project level npm-rc files for some other purpose that would be, contradicted, or where they need it to not be checked in for whatever reason.
But I would imagine that you have project level config anyways that has project like specifics to projects anyways. Like,
you'd probably have your registry if nothing else.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of where my head goes, is like where this would be. There'd probably be a lot less discussion about, the naming and everything else, and like how we're going to support this, and then also, I think we're conceptualizing how like npm then would use this information, even though this probably like is meant to have capabilities beyond just our registry, right? So I think the CLI, it would be easier to support something that was just like a config in an npm-rc, like headers, and then just pass those through.
That would certainly be easier to support. Yeah.
Yeah,
and then
I'm not sure, Mark, like, is there any pushback from your end why you would really want it to be in package JSON?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, other than I think in our particular case, we probably don't parse at the moment the npm-rc files or get hold of that information.
Well, you would just get it in.
This is purely.
You would still just get it on the server side the same way, right? You're still going to get the npm app ID header on the server. It's just a matter of kind of where you write it in your project in order to send that.
Yep, but this would be, so you're suggesting for still a generic version, so like within a metadata object to have a key value pair within the npm-rc file?
No, I'm suggesting there would be a new config value called headers, which would be a list.
Okay. So it's the same approach I've taken, just moving it to the npm-rc instead, yeah.
Would that be better? Like, what do you think? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I just posted a comment on the PR with some of these options. I'm kind of leaning toward that project level npm-rc the more I think about it. It is certainly a lot easier to do because the options that we're going to be passing to we already parsed that in. We already kind of have that object there. We could even add some semantics that if we get a particular header from the registry, we go ahead and add that to the project level config and save it. It wouldn't it would actually be somewhat easier than stashing it in package JSON and maybe less disruptive.
Nathan had a note, and then Roy, if you want to. Nathan, did you want to share what you noted there in chat?
Sure. So I was just commenting from a security perspective, it makes more sense to be in the NPM RC also. Inevitably, if you allow people to send arbitrary headers, then things like authorization tokens are going to end up in there. And if that's in the NPM RC, which is already established as containing secrets, then it's something that people will be a little less surprised by, at least.
Roy, did you want to add to that?
Right, which is a great point that Nathan brings. But I would like to also point there's a separate conversation about bringing config to package JSON altogether. But that's a separate one and a much larger one, right? And I think it would implicate this kind of security issues Nathan just mentioned.
Actually, Nathan, you bring that up makes me actually a little bit worried, because already having the secrets in the NPMRC is a problem for security, right? So if we do make that worse here, I'm a little concerned, which I think you're right. People would inevitably put that in the NPMRC. I was thinking more of it being derived. The reason I was thinking of it as a config value being a good thing was you'd pass it on the command line, right? So you could like store it encrypted and then decrypt it as part of your, install command or something. But if people start hard coding tokens, then we're just introducing another vector, which we will have to migrate off at some point, presumably, right? Because nobody thinks that the NPM tokens in the NPMRC is actually a good thing. Right?
Yeah, so their default ignored on publish. So like that's, we know that people use and put stuff in there that we don't want, distributed. So I mean, if you're talking about Wes, you're concerned about like people checking that in to like a repo, is that sort of the concern?
Yeah, totally. I mean, this has happened multiple times that we have leaked a credential because somebody published something, they pushed to a repo that was public on GitHub with the NPMRC containing their own token. So I think this is another risk for that situation.
So I don't think it makes it worse though. Right, we don't store your login token by default in the project level config. We could even add some more kind of guardrails around what we store in there, or which config values we allow to be stored in project level configs. It doesn't make the security risk worse, and I think adding a generic headers field to package JSON does. You know what I mean? And we can talk more or have other RFCs. I think there's tons of great ideas around how we could make project level configs less risky. But I'm not sure that this actually makes it any more risky. It sort of adds on to the problem we already know we have.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think this should be considered a blocker because it's just a continuation of the problem we already have. Just concerning whenever we add more surface area that has the exact same thing we already know is a problem, I guess. So,
and this probably incentivizes the usage, right? So, okay, Mark, are you picking up, just a quick question on this RC itself, are you sort of picking up where your colleague left off with this? Do you have access to update this RC?
I do, yeah. Yeah,
okay.
I made the last change. I did the change and he then merged it into his.
Sure. Is it possible to maybe change the name, the title of the RC, so we aren't referencing the app ID specifically?
Sure.
And then based on this feedback, I'm wondering if we've come to a bit of consensus on what we like. Like, I know that personally I'm a fan of the project level NPMRC route. Mark, would you be willing to just update this to reflect that, like update the example of how to pass through these headers? Yep. I think also showing an example of to Wes's point, showing the example of setting this via config as well might be interesting, just so the example usage of running npm, I guess it would be npm publish with like that config set would be a good example. whatever that is, like -- headers equals app ID, like how that might look, would be good to.
Yep, I can get them added for sure.
Awesome. Did anybody else have any comments they wanted to add to this? If not, I think that's pretty good. Like, we'll actually get some movement on this, and we can actually put this on the roadmap here. So
one possible idea that would actually get us back to the ability for a registry to set the npm app ID would be if we see a header coming back from the registry that sets, npm-app-id, then we'll go ahead and save that as a project level config. Like we can add that semantic onto that particular header without, I think, violating any kind of like existing precedent with how we handle things, since there's already other npm specific headers that we handle in fancy ways.
So you're saying separately we would support an app, specifically an app ID?
Yeah. So I think specifically if we get an
into two RFCs, one for the support of if we see an app ID coming back from the response headers, then we'll store it back to config. Would that be?
Yeah. So the first one would be we add a config value called headers, which is a list type, list of strings that we'll pass through. The second is if we get an npm app ID, then we save it to the project config.
Yep.
And the second kind of builds on the first and gets us everything that we had talked about and all the reasons for having it stored in package.json, which I quite like.
So does that give you everything you want, Mark? In both?
The first one does. I'm not quite following the use case from the server end, to be honest. For the second part that you mentioned, the additional part.
So let's say you're starting a net new project. Let's say you're installing. Well, actually, yeah. How does that work?
So the way that I would do it, if I worked for Sonatype, is I would say, look, we want to have app level tracking for all our projects, right? So if we get an audit, if something hits our audit endpoint and it does not have an app ID in the headers, then let's mint a new app ID and send it back in the header and say, okay, this is the app you're working on now, right?
Got you. So it's a way of, if it's missing, we can create a pseudo name for it.
Yeah.
Got you. Okay.
And then the user doesn't, and then you're getting out of the human error issue of like, copy pasting it wrong or putting the wrong field in there, putting the wrong config in there, etc.
Yeah, and then you're saying and then the client would save that as well.
Would save it to the project config, yeah. And you could also send a. I'll post an example, but I'll write this up. Try to write this up today and post an example. But then you would. You could also send an npm notice header that says, "Hey, I've just put something in your npm.npmrc file. You want to check it in."
Yep, that makes sense. That's a nice way of onboarding new applications quite easily then as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
So it sounds like there's a bit of work just to break those two concepts out. If that's okay, I think they are distinct enough to probably, ensure that they are separate RFCs. So if you can take that on, Mark, then we'd love to.
Yep, I can take that new one on as well. Yep.
Thank you.
Would I need to reference the old one? I guess it'd probably be worthwhile, wouldn't it?
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool.
I appreciate your patience.
Yeah, no problem.
Again, I apologize. The notification, my inbox is a bit crazy, and I know you've poked us on this for a while. So,
thank you.
Cool. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add before we move on to the last couple? If not, yeah. So the second last item here we had was the RC for NPM audit and audit resolve JSON. So number 18, I know CB's not on the call, and I guess I can give a bit of an update here. And I think Wes, who's on the call, was in the, essentially we had an out of band package maintenance working group call for this work, and sort of trying to kick off the discussion on what it is we're trying to solve for here. Wes, I'm not sure if you have any anything you want to add from that call.
Well, I think we came out of it with a rough idea of what might work. So I don't know if you want to talk about where we landed there. You know, I know we haven't gone through the rest of the steps, which we have a few outcomes that came from it. One is we need to talk with some folks at Sneak as well, and then probably have a continued discussion in the package maintenance working group. But it sort of centers around the idea of letting users specify a source for which they will load a ignore list for certain CVEs. And so then the proposal, which would probably end up being an RFC at some point, if everybody agrees that this is a good way forward, would be that the client, the CLI, takes that config value, fetches the ignore lists, and then applies those when reporting back the audit results. And this would be one way to enable. So the original RFC here is to do the audit resolve feature just for each application level. But what we were discussing this morning was really trying to federate that out more to package maintainers and other authorities. So if you had a company-wide list you wanted to implement, or you had authors which you trusted to maintain a list of ignores, you could do that. So that's sort of the outcome that we're discussing, proposing to the NPM, but then also it'll require, I think, something from Sneak as well here. I don't think there's enough people who use that as their main interface for this data that I think it would be meaningful. So is that a good synopsis, you think?
That's great. Yeah, I think we were, at least where my personal understanding of that was, that we want to have that list live, hypothetically near where the CVE list is coming from, so you could support both those, right? And so in our case, or GitHub's case, potentially having a CVE database, advisory database, also you would have a corresponding resolution sort of DB or something, or some place to have that list live. And that's based a little bit off of some feedback that I got when I poked Adam Baldwin, who said, there needs to be an audit trail. This thing needs to be immutable. There needs to be, so it just didn't make as much sense to have it live in package JSON or in the package itself, which is sort of deviating from this original RFC's concept of having this resolve JSON, and more looking for a different source of truth, which is outside of the package itself, right? So
maybe just to add on to that, there's a specific technical reason why having it in the package JSON is bad, which I think is what Adam pointed out, right? Is that once you publish it, if you have that version, then the resolution is to publish again, which at that point you have to get everybody to update, and it doesn't really work technically. So
that's the crux, right? So if somebody says your package is bad, you have no way of saying, no, it's not, without publishing a new version. So that's the one, or your package is bad, but your package is affected. So that's been, there's a lot of discussion around, the current way in which the life cycle of CV affects the ecosystem. And I think we have some work to do there. But yeah, that was a great synopsis of sort of what's going on. So I'm not sure if anybody else had anything they want to add to that. It's more, I can't point specifically to meeting notes. We actually ran that call offline.
But are we thinking about just dropping the current idea from this RFC altogether, having the audit resolve JSON?
I think we would potentially just change audit resolve JSON being the source of truth. The shape of what TV's put together may not change. This is a good first crack at what it would look like to writing, let's say, like, to having that metadata look like that. So I'm not going to say that this isn't like invalid yet, or we would ask for changes until. I think the key here is like having it live inside the package JSON for sure is something that we probably don't want to see. So.
Yeah, sure. But having the audit resolve at your project level, that idea still stands, or?
Oh, so you're talking the project versus the like dep level, like the root author level versus the maintainer, or
yeah, like, because I could see like just the client looking for these providers and in order to feed the audit resolve, right? But also just manually picking stuff that the user wants to ignore and have it into audit resolve for the project level.
Well, one thing I was considering, which might be solve both of these problems, would be that if the source of the data was just anything that was in a package spec, so it could be a file, right? So you could just say, /, audit resolve, and then that would be the thing that contains your sources of your, the data. And then it could also be a, package spec, right? Like from the registry, or it could be a Git URL, or what, like anything that could be resolved.
Or a local file, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be a URL or an endpoint, right? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. It's just because that it looks like this RFC, like we might just move away from it completely, right? I don't know.
So, well, I think the point is we just can't have it in the package JSON. If you took everything that is the contents of this RFC, which is more than just that it lives in package JSON, I think you could move that part out into, say, it's just something that can be referenced via a package spec. And then what's in that package is this metadata format and the feature set that he's proposing, right? It's just that it doesn't live in the package JSON.
Or the package itself. Sorry, those two. Yeah, right.
Yeah, actually, if you move it out of package JSON, it's actually optional whether it lives in the package itself or not, right? Because if it's a spec, you could, in theory, publish the package and it could contain an audit resolve in it, which it's self-referential, because that could be for like an application, right? But then for like the maintainer version that we're talking about, you wouldn't do it like that because of the problem we talked about with it being in the package. So you'd have to reference it externally, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's definitely some changes to like this that we'll ask for from this RC, but I essentially wanted to leave this on the agenda to say that, we're having this conversation. This isn't something where we've forgot about, and this is still something that I think we care about in terms of reducing the noise and ensuring people aren't. I think the crux of the discussion from today was also, it's getting riskier if people consider like audit warnings to be just noise. They're getting sort of like fatigue. And so they'll start to ignore those warnings and they won't be as meaningful, right? So
you're describing something that's already happened, for the record, not something that will happen in the future.
Yeah, that is exactly why we took such pains to tighten up those error messages or those warnings in V7, specifically because it's too much and it's too many characters flying by on your screen, and most of them are not really helping you know exactly what you need to change, and so it's sort of
or worse, they're not meaningful, right? Like,
too much detail. Yeah, like too much detail is actually in many cases worse than not enough.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to be mindful of time. I added this last issue that Christian created, the RFC number 223. So adding the ability for NPM audit to run against the package that you haven't installed yet. Did you want to quickly maybe summarize this, Christian?
Yeah, so this is basically just an idea I'm basically just throwing around and just seeing if anyone else feels that this should be implemented. And then I would present something that's a bit more thoughtful. But my idea is basically that whenever you add a package and it might have issues, and you might be in a corporate environment. For example, we have a firewall that gives us a forbidden for a package that has security issues. So we don't even get the package, and we just have the characters flying by. And it would be nice to have some sort of implication of like how secure or not secure the package that you're about to install is. So I'm basically trying to figure out the impact beforehand. That's the entire point.
With the new, so I'll say with the new audit endpoint that we're using now, the bulk advisory endpoint, it is incredibly easy to say, given a specific package name and version, show me any advisories that affect that particular version. What is less easy is to say for a given package and range, or even just everything for a given package name. I don't believe that there's a capacity to do that. So you have to, the way we're using it now, basically we get a list of the names and versions of everything in your tree, and then we send that up as a one big object. And that's actually how we do audits of what's local. If we wanted to say npm audit package name, that would be pretty easy to do with that new endpoint. With the older endpoint, it receives a package tree in the form of essentially the same data object that you have in package lock.json. So the older advisory endpoint, it would be pretty challenging to do that, right? Because it has to be a valid package tree, and it's got other restrictions on it and so on. So if we were willing to say that this only works if you have the bulk advisory endpoint implemented, then I'd say like, yeah, it's a great idea. Let's do it. It's pretty easy to do. The other thing that we would not be able to do is to say, or what would be more challenging, and where I think it might not quite meet your needs here, would be to say, I want to install foo. Foo depends on bar, and bar has a vulnerability against it. So if the use case here is actually, let me find if there's any advisories that will be pulled in as a result of adding foo as a dependency, even advisories on other things which make foo vulnerable, and make foo something I can't install, that's a little bit of a stickier problem. It's a little bit more work. But I still think it's not impossible. And I think it's worth, it just means that we'll have to kind of essentially build an ideal tree with just that one node, and then do an audit on it and see what that says.
Yeah. So
I would like support for this concept. I know, Isaac, you jumped into a bunch of technical deals, but I think I've said this a bunch of times. Once you've installed the package, if it's got a problem, you've already risked.
You're already owned.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, we should absolutely be looking at ways to audit before unpacking. One thing I had thought about, which might be a possible solution, and this is a big change, so I probably won't land in this forum, but include it in the pacument. Like include the metadata about the currently known CVEs, so augment the pacument data so that you can do it by just fetching the metadata. But that I think would be a pretty big registry change. So
it would, and it's complicated because they sort of they're updated out of step with one another. And so from basically denormalizing the data in that way ends up being kind of a tricky problem.
I was going to say this could be added to like npm view, but yeah, it's
yeah, it would actually. That is a good idea. We could add it to npm view. Just say like this, installing this. This has the following CVEs
yeah,
against it.
that might sound way better. Yeah, because I was going to also raise the point that in the CLI, if we are thinking already like adding sub commands to audit, maybe it wouldn't be ideal to just add npm audit and then a spec, right? just to not limit what we can use as subcommands. But I do think it sounds way better as just like an output of npm view.
Yeah.
Noted.
Can I ask a quick question? Is there a reason why you can't take the ideal tree from Arborist today and just make a package lock, even though, and just like, make the result or whatever the paths, null or something, or, so that you could just do it from an ideal tree instead of actually reifying it?
You can. I mean, you can do npm install -- package lock only, and that'll do exactly that. It'll still run the audit. We kick off the audit before we start unpacking things. It takes a minute, and so we do it in parallel. But if you have a package lock and you run npm audit, like, it's going to just use that. It's just going to use the virtual tree.
So just to be mindful of time, I know we're over now a couple minutes. Christian, hopefully that gives you a bit of feedback on thoughts. Definitely, this is something it sounds like there'd be support for, but maybe we could also look at what it would look like if we actually bubbled up this information in npm view. So maybe you can see what the output looks like today of npm view, and then especially in the beta, go and poke at that. And then maybe how we could add it to that would be good.
Sure.
Okay. Appreciate everybody jumping on today, and feel free to keep up conversations in the RFCs themselves. And then I hopefully will see you all next week. Ciao.
See you next week.
Have fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.